Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive where we take a stack of research and really get into it. Today we're talking about action bias. You ever get that feeling like you just got to do something, even if it's probably not the best thing to do?
Yeah, it's like this urge to take action instead of just sitting back, even when maybe doing nothing is the smarter move.
So it's not just about being a go-getter or whatever. There's got to be something deeper going on, right?
Yeah.
What does the research say about this whole action bias thing?
Well, there's some really interesting research on this. Back in the 90s, there was this study on soccer goalies during penalty kicks. They looked at a ton of penalty kicks and found that goalies almost always jump to one side, even though statistically staying in the center is better.
Whoa, so they knew staying in the middle is better, but still jumped. That's crazy.
Yeah, it really shows how strong this bias can be, even when it's a high-pressure situation. Researchers think it might be because of what's seen as normal in soccer, like everyone expects the goalie to dive, so standing still might look like they're giving up.
Makes sense. So it's not just about what's going on in our heads. There's like this pressure from everyone else to just do something, even if it's not the best something.
Exactly. And this pressure is even stronger when there's a lot at stake or it seems like you have to act fast. Like, think about the stock market. When prices are dropping, a lot of people panic and sell, even though holding on might be smarter in the long run.
Oh yeah, I've totally done that. It feels like you have to do something, even if that something loses you money.
Yeah, and another big reason for this action bias is that we don't want to be blamed. We feel worse about bad things that happen because of something we did compared to bad things that happened because we did nothing.
That's interesting. So we're more likely to beat ourselves up over stuff we did, even if not doing anything would have had the same result. So our brains are basically tricking us.
In a way, yeah. Our brains like action and see not acting as a threat. It makes us feel like we're not in control. This probably comes from way back when we were evolving. Like when you're trying not to get eaten by a lion, doing something's probably better than just waiting around, even if you make a mistake.
That makes sense. But in today's world, that instinct to act can really backfire.
Yeah, and that's why it's so important to understand action bias. Once we're aware of it, we can start to catch ourselves when it's affecting our decisions.
So how do we escape this need to always be doing something? Are we stuck with this bias forever?
Not at all. There are things we can do to make better choices, even when we're unsure or feeling pressure. But before we get into those, let's look at a few more examples of how action bias shows up in real life.
Okay, I'm ready for some more examples.
Let's talk about a study on replacing lead pipes in water systems. Now, you'd think that getting lead out of drinking water is always good, right?
Of course. Lead's bad. Wouldn't want to get rid of it?
Right, but what they found is that replacing only part of the lead pipe, which is sometimes done, can actually make things worse. Because when you mess with the pipes, it can stir up lead that would have stayed put if you just replaced the whole thing.
Oh, wow. So doing something was actually worse than doing nothing. That's a good reminder to think about what might happen because of our actions, even when those actions seem like the obvious solution.
Exactly. Sometimes you need to really analyze the situation and understand how it all works before jumping into action.
Okay, that's a powerful example. Really makes you think twice about that just do something attitude. So where else do we see action bias popping up?
Well, it can affect all sorts of things, from our relationships to the decisions made by people in charge of companies. Imagine a company where sales suddenly drop. Everyone's looking at the CEO waiting for them to do something.
Yeah, that's got to be a lot of pressure. So do they just come up with some new plan without figuring out the problem first?
Unfortunately, that happens a lot. Action bias can lead to impulsive decisions that cause more problems than they solve.
So like that saying, don't just do something, stand there. Sometimes the best strategy is to step back, think it through, and consider all the options, even doing nothing.
Exactly. And that's what we'll be talking about in the next part of our deep dive. We'll look at how to overcome action bias and make better choices.
Can't wait to hear about those. Join us next time as we continue our deep dive into action bias and learn some practical tools for navigating the world with a more mindful approach to action.
Welcome back to our deep dive on action bias. We've seen how this urge to do something, even when it might be better to do nothing, can lead to some pretty impulsive decisions, and how those decisions can have unintended consequences, from soccer goalies all the way to CEOs.
Right. We talked about how this need to do something is driven by things like social pressure, fear of blame, and just our natural desire to feel in control. But now let's get practical. How can we actually overcome this bias and start making better choices?
Well, one really powerful strategy is to cultivate what I like to call reflective inaction. It's basically about hitting pause on that automatic reaction to jump into action. and instead giving yourself some space to really think things through.
Reflective inaction. I like that. So how do we actually do reflective inaction?
It starts by asking yourself some key questions before you do anything. Like, what are the possible consequences of both doing something and doing nothing? What are the potential benefits and risks of each option?
So like a pros and cons list, but for both action and inaction. We often only think about the bad things that could happen if we do nothing, but we forget about the bad things that could happen if we do something.
Exactly. It's about challenging our assumptions and looking at things from different angles. Then ask yourself what information you might be missing. What else do you need to know before you make a decision? This is where research and analysis come in.
So instead of just going with our gut, we need to gather some data, talk to different people, and really dig into the issue. Kind of like a detective gathering clues before making a move.
Exactly. And often when we go through this process of gathering information and analyzing the situation, we realize that our initial urge to act was based on some wrong assumptions. It can really help us avoid making rash decisions based on fear or pressure.
You know, this reminds me of something we talked about earlier, that idea of talking to trusted advisors. Having people who can offer different perspectives and challenge our thinking can be so helpful when making decisions.
Absolutely. Bouncing ideas off someone you trust, someone who's not afraid to tell you you're wrong, can help you see your blind spots. It's like having a built-in check and balance system for your thought process.
Like a personal board of directors for your life. But let's be real. Sometimes, even with all the information and advice in the world, making a decision can feel impossible. What happens when we get stuck in analysis paralysis, unable to move forward? Is there a danger of overthinking things?
Oh, definitely. That's a common challenge. And it's actually where action bias can sneak back in. We get so caught up in gathering information and analyzing every single possibility that we get overwhelmed and can't decide.
So how do we find that balance between thinking things through and actually taking action? How do we avoid getting stuck in that endless loop of thinking and rethinking?
One approach is to develop a decision-making framework. This framework should include everything we've talked about: pausing, gathering information, considering different options, and talking to advisors. But it also needs a clear timeline and specific criteria for making a decision.
So we're setting boundaries for our thinking process. We're giving ourselves time to reflect, but we're also setting a deadline to avoid getting lost in all the analysis.
Right. And by deciding what makes a decision good, we can move away from just how we feel and make choices that align with our goals and values.
So instead of just going with what feels right in the moment, we're basing our decisions on a more structured process.
Exactly. It's about taking a more conscious and intentional approach to decision making. But even with the best decision making frameworks, we're still going to make mistakes sometimes. That's just part of being human. And this is where another interesting aspect of action bias comes in: the role of regret.
Oh yeah, regret, that feeling of, I should have done things differently, that always seems to pop up at the worst time.
Yeah, and research has shown that we tend to feel more regret over things we did that turned out bad compared to things we didn't do that had the same bad result.
So we're harder on ourselves for things we did, even if not doing anything would have led to the same outcome. That doesn't seem very fair.
It might not, but it goes back to that need for control we talked about. When we take action, we feel more responsible for the outcome, and therefore we feel more regret when things don't go as planned.
It's like we're blaming ourselves for things that were out of our control.
Kind of, but this understanding can actually be empowering.
How so? How can understanding that we tend to regret actions more than inactions help us make better decisions?
Well, by recognizing this tendency, we can change how we think about regret. Instead of seeing it as a failure, we can see it as a chance to learn.
So instead of, I shouldn't have done that, it's, what can I learn from this? How can I use this to make a better choice next time?
Exactly. And this brings us back to self-awareness. The more we understand our own biases and how they affect our thinking, the better we'll be at making decisions.
It's like we're becoming more conscious drivers of our own lives.
That's it. That's what overcoming action bias is all about. Developing the skills and awareness to make choices that truly align with our goals, values, and the best information we have.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've explored the psychology behind action bias, looked at real-world examples, and even talked about strategies for overcoming it. But I'm curious, what about future research in this area? Are there any new frontiers in understanding action bias?
There definitely are. One area that's really interesting is how action bias interacts with other cognitive biases. For example, how does confirmation bias, our tendency to look for information that supports what we already believe, play a role?
Oh, that's a good question. It seems like those two biases could work together to create this kind of action echo chamber. where we only look for information that supports our desire to act, even if that information isn't accurate.
Exactly. And understanding these complex relationships between different biases can help us develop even better strategies for making good decisions. Another area that's getting a lot of attention is the role of technology in shaping and maybe even amplifying action bias.
Oh, interesting. How do you see technology playing a role?
Well, think about all the notifications we get on our phones and computers. Every ping is like a call to action, a demand for our attention, and this can create a sense of urgency, a pressure to respond right away, even if the task isn't actually that important.
So it's like we're being trained to always be reacting and doing, which makes it harder to step back and do that reflective inaction we were talking about.
Right. So as technology becomes even more integrated into our lives, it's really important to understand how it might be affecting our decision making and how it might be making our biases worse.
It sounds like there's still so much to learn about action bias and how it impacts our lives.
There is. It's a fascinating and complex area of study with huge implications for how we live, work, and interact with the world.
Well, this has been a really insightful deep dive into action bias. We've learned a lot about its origins, its impact, and most importantly, how to overcome it. But we're not done yet. Join us for the final part of this episode where we'll explore the benefits of overcoming action bias and discuss what it means for living a more mindful and intentional life. All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into action bias.
We've spent the last two parts uncovering this tendency to favor action and looking at how it can lead us to make some not-so-great decisions.
And we learned about some pretty cool strategies to help us overcome it. But now I'm curious about the upside.
Yeah, what do we gain by being more aware of action bias and actually using those strategies?
Like, what are the rewards for all this work?
Well, I think one of the biggest benefits is that we just make better decisions overall. When we resist that urge to react immediately and embrace what we call reflective inaction, we can make choices that are more in line with our long-term goals, our values, and the facts.
So instead of just reacting to whatever life throws at us, we're more in control.
Exactly. And this shift from reactive to proactive can really change things for the better in all parts of our lives.
It's like leveling up our decision-making skills across the board.
Yeah.
But beyond those practical benefits, I bet there are some positive effects on our well-being too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Being in that reactive mode all the time, always feeling like we have to do something, can be super draining. It's stressful, and it makes it harder to think clearly.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly running but not really getting anywhere.
Right. But when we learn to pause, to step back and choose our actions more deliberately, we can break free from that cycle of reactivity and feel more calm and in control.
And I imagine that greater sense of control can also help us understand ourselves better.
Definitely. As we pay more attention to how we make decisions, we start to see our own patterns, our triggers, and those sneaky biases that can creep in. And that self-awareness gives us the power to make more conscious choices. Choices that really reflect who we are and what we believe in.
It's like we're becoming the authors of our own lives.
Exactly. And that's the real magic of understanding and overcoming action bias. It's not just about making smarter choices. It's about living a more mindful and intentional life.
Well, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, we want to leave you with something to think about. Now that you know about action bias, how might you approach decisions differently?
Where has action bias tripped you up in the past? And where could that power of the pause really make a difference?
Remember, becoming a better decision maker is a journey, not a destination. So stay curious, keep learning, and keep exploring the amazing complexities of human behavior. Until next time, folks,